Hello everyone and welcome to me reading a book, so Alex Rider. Chapter 19, White Water. Alex went back to the plane and rummaging around in the hold. Rummaging around in the hold. Rummaging around in the hold, soon found out what he was looking for. Wait, so if I didn't say too much, yes, I am reading you this book called Alex Rider, and I'm on chapter 19. Right, let's start from the beginning. I'm on chapter 19 currently, and I'm going to read you from it and beyond. So goodbye. So let's start reading. Alex went back to the plane and rummaging around in the hold, soon found what he was looking for. 2 empty jerry cans which might have been used to carry water or fuel. He needed a length of rubber tubing and tore it out of the engine itself. It didn't matter. This plane wasn't going anywhere. He opened the cap under the wing and put one end of the rubber tube into the fuel tank and other into his mouth, and sucked back, reeling back, gagging at the acrid taste of aviation fuel cut into his throat. Nothing happened. He forced himself to cry again, and this time it worked. He had created a vacuum and the liquid was flowing out. He had dragged the jerry cans and filled them both. By the time he had finished, the cans were almost too heavy to lift. Gritting his teeth, he set across the lawn, heading back to the hospital. He knew he was taking a risk, but he didn't care. He wondered how many other people had been brought here. Poor refugees who had sent out in hope of a better life, who had never arrived. He wanted to wipe this place off the face of the earth. Someone should have done it years ago. The biggest risk of all was creeping into Dr. Tanner's office. The first cracks of light were appearing in the sky, and one of the nurses might wake up at any time. But he found what he was looking for in the drawer of the doctor's desk, a cigarette lighter. Tanner should have known that smoking could be harmful to his health. It was certainly going to provide expensive. Moving faster, but still being careful not to make any sound, Alex splashed the fuel over the side of the hospital. The veranda, the porch, it sat on top of the rainwater, not mixing it. He saw it in the puddles, a strange mauve colour that almost seemed to glow. When he just had half a can left, he went back to the lake, leaving a trail of fuel behind him. He threw the empty can into the water, then climbed into the makeshift kayak, resting the paddle across his legs. He was almost ready. The paddle was too short, and the kayak hopelessly unbalanced. It should have been trimmed out, the bow and the stern holding the same position in the water, but unfortunately, the hole he had made wasn't central. He tried to shift his weight at once. He found himself wavering helplessly and thought it was going to be capsized. But at the last minute, he managed to right himself. He tried again, more consciously. This time, he succeeded. The float sat evenly on the surface. He dropped a shoulder. The fiberglass dug into his back, but the kayak tilted slightly. He had it under control. He took a deep breath and pushed off. At the last minute, he flickered the light on. The tiny flame leaped up, battling against the falling rain. Alex touched it against the grass, and at once the fire took hold. Rushing up towards the hospital, which was now clearly visible in the rapidly breaking day. Alex didn't wait to see it arrive. He was already paddling, leaning forward, and driving with his shoulders to give each stroke more power. Alex, with more power. He wobbled a couple of times as he got used to it, but the flow was living up to its name. It was carrying him away. Behind him, the lines of the flames reached the hospital. Reach the hospital. The result was more spectacular than I could have hoped for. The rainwater had spread the aviation fuel everywhere. And although the wood was wet on the surface, years of Australian sunshine had baked it dry inside. Alex heard the soft explosion as the fire caught hold, and Alex heard the soft explosion as the fire caught hold and felt the heat on his shoulders. He glanced back and saw that the entire building had become a fireball. The air was actually steaming as it hit the roof. There was an epic struggle going on between the falling water and the rising flames. Nobody had come outside yet, but a moment later Jacko was there, shocked out of his sleep and unable to take in what was happening. He was followed by Dr. Tanner. By now it wasn't just the hospital that was on fire. Their administration centre and one of the houses had also caught alight. The whole compound was being torn apart. Suddenly American V. Weinberg appeared, dressed ridiculously in striped pyjamas, his trouser legs on fire, and he smiled grimly as he hoped about, screaming in the rain. It wasn't just his eyes that were going to need medical treatment. Tanner looked around him and saw Crombie lying motionlessly on the grass, next to the great bulk of the filing cabinet. He understood at once. "The boy!" he shouted. "Find the boy!" Weinberg had thrown himself into a puddle and lay there whimpering. The rest of them ignored him, scattering around the complex searching for Alex. But even if they had thought to look out the lake, they would have been too late. Alex was already out of sight. Behind the curtain of rain, there was a deafening crack at the generator, shuddered to a halt with a series of sparks and plume of black smoke. Unable to contend with the joint attacking of water and fire, the electricity had failed. Tanner howled. "Sir?" The plane. Jacko had noticed the Piper resting lopsidedly on its single float. Too steep, the nearest trees simply disappeared into the water, their roots trailing down with the ugly-looking rocks behind. But at least he was putting distance between himself and the compound, and all was left of it. And Dr. Tanner already told him that there were no boats. The Piper was a wreck. The smoke was still rising from the hospital. He could see it over the line of the trees. There was no way that anyone would be able to follow him. He turned the corner and came to the first section of rapids. The sight reminded him that he wasn't safe yet. The worst still lay ahead before him, and he might only have exchanged one death for another. Ahead of him, the river dipped steeply downwards, hemmed in by massive boulders and tree trunks on both sides. A series of jagged ledges had created a sort of natural staircase. If he landed where the water was too shallow, the kayak would be snapped in half, and ice with it. White water was frothing and foaming, with thousands of gallons thundering down from one level to the next. To make matters worse, the whole stretch was dotted with boils, areas where the water was rushing to the surface, as if it were being heated in a sauce. Heated in a saucepan. He one of those, and he would lose all control, and then he'd be completely at the mercy of the river. The thing is, Alex, you're never really in control. Whatever you may think, just keep paddling and never fight the current, because the current will always win. The words of his uncle, spoken what seemed like a lifetime ago, came to his mind, and he wished he could grasp some comfort from them. He felt like a loose button in a washing machine. His fate was out of his plane. Gritting his teeth, he tightened his hold on the paddle and charged forward. Nothing made sense after that. He was fighting, thrown left and right, blind. Water was shooting past him, smashing into his face, pounding from above. He dug down using a forward sweep to turn the float, missing a black boulder with vicious, razor-sharp edges by a matter of centimeters. The green canopy spun around him. The trees had all blurred into one another. He couldn't hear. His eyes were full of water, and when he opened his mouth, gasping for air, water rushed down his throat. 2 more sweep strokes, dodging the rocks. There was a terrible crash as the kayak slammed into one of the shelves. Mercifully, it stayed in one piece. A huge blanket of water fell on him, and he went under. He was drowning, but then suddenly, somehow, he was through. He felt battered and exhausted, as if he had just been in hand-to-hand combat with the river, which, in a sense, he had. His stomach and back were on fire where the broke edges had cut into him. Alex slid a hand under the sodden rag that was his shirt and felt the damage. When he took it out, his fingers were bloody. Behind him, white water leapt and hurled itself against the rocks, displaying its fury that the kayak had got through, and knew he wouldn't be able to take much more. It was only desperation and pure luck that had brought him this far. From the moment he had entered the white water, he had lost all his sense of gravity, which really meant that he had lost everything. He might as well have been a piece of driftwood being swept no matter where. It wasn't just that the kayak was the wrong shape. It wasn't a kayak at all. It was a float ripped off. It wasn't a kayak at all. It was a float ripped off a seaplane. And if Alex had decided, after all, to steal a coffin for the journey, he doubted he would have any less control. He tried to remember what Dr. Tanner had told him about the river. After the first rapids, it got worse, and then a mile downstream came something called the Bora Falls, and he didn't like the sound of that. He knew he had to find somewhere to come ashore and take his chances in top of the rainforest. To take his chances in the rainforest. He had already covered a fair amount of ground. With a bit of luck, he might even reach the edge of the floodplain on each side. There had become civilization, Doctor. There had to be some civilization somewhere in this area. A ranger, a flying doctor, somebody, somewhere. How he would find them. But there was still nowhere to land. The banks climbed steeply, rocks forming an almost unbroken barrier. When he looked up, the tops of trees seemed a long way away. As wet as he was, Alex wasn't cold. The rainforest throbbed with its own muddy heat. He was moving swiftly, but still being swept along by the current. He was listening out for the next stretch of rapids, but that wasn't what he heard. Instead, it was the last thing he had expected. A helicopter. If he had still been in the rapids, he wouldn't have been. He would be right now using one of the straits where the water was fast moving but silent. Even so, he had to look up to make sure he wasn't imagining it. Somehow, it seemed unlikely early in the morning, in the middle of Australian rainforest, but there was a small speck, some distance behind, but drawing nearer with every second. Alex's first thoughts was that MI6 had finally arrived. Almost when it was too late, he looked back a second time and felt his hopes shrivel and die. There was something mean and sinister about the helicopter, the way it was zeroing in on him like an insect about to sting. If MI6 was something, they would have been here days ago. No, this was something else, and it wasn't on his side. The helicopter was a Bell UH-1D, a Huey, one of the most famous flying machines in the world. Ever since the Americans had sent hundreds of them to Vietnam back in the 60s, Alex recognized the long, slim false sleeve with the extend tail. The cargo door was open and there was a man sitting with his legs hanging out with some sort of weapon on his lap. It had to be nothing more than bad luck. Dr. Tanner have summoned up support in the few minutes that Alex had been gone. The helicopter must have been on its way anyway, perhaps dropping off supplies, and Tanner had simply redirected it after him. Alex had nowhere to hide. He was in the middle of the river, and he wasn't moving fast enough to get away. At least the helicopter didn't seem to be equipped with door guns, rocket launchers, or anti-tank missiles, and the man only had a rifle. That was good too. If it had been a machine gun, Alex would have had no chance at all. But even so, a half-decent marksman man would be able to pick him off with no trouble. Suddenly, Alex's back and shoulders were horribly exposed. He could almost feel the first bullet slamming into them. He lowered his head towards the water, changing into a centre of gravity and tilting the float onto its left. His left shoulder was touching the water now, and as he lanced forward, pounding down with the paddle, he aimed for the nearest bank. It was a stroke known as the lower brace, and Alex hoped that, as well as giving him an extra momentum through the water, it would always present less of a target to a sniper up above. Something snapped against the surface centimetres from his head, and a microsecond later, the discharge of the rifle. The bullet had reached him faster than its sound. Alex jerked upright again, water dripping off the side of his face, but he reached destination. A clump of trees hanging over the river, forming a green tunnel for him to go through. At least he would be out of sight for about 50 metres. The next stretch of white water was about 50 metres in front of him. Directly ahead, the rapids had been his enemy, but now in a strange way they had become his friend. The churning water, the spinning current, and the waves tossing him from side to side. Could he reach them? The helicopters were directly above him. Above, the leaves and branches were thrashing around madly, tearing themselves apart. The downdraft was beating at the river, and the howl of the Huey's engines was shattering the very air. Alex emerged from the tunnel and dug down, using all the strength of his upper body and shoulders to propel himself forward. There were two more shots. One of them hit the kayak, and Alex found himself staring at a hole right in front of him. It had been fired at an angle, boring through the fiberglass and exciting just above the waterline. It must have missed his leg, but barely a centimetre to spare. Left and then right. Two more power strokes, and he was into the rapids. He had time to pick a line or form any strategy for surviving the next section. This stretch was even worse than the first one, with faster water, a bigger slope, rocks that seemed purposely built to impale him or tear him in half. Even the sniper seemed to hesitate, letting the river do its work for him. When in doubt, keep paddling. That had been another of Iron Rider's instructions. And I did just the thing, swinging the paddle automatically, first one side, then the other, battling his way through the helicopter. The helicopter had disappeared. The spray had wiped it out. Surely that meant they couldn't see him. There was an ear-splitting bang, but it wasn't a rifle. The nose of the kayaker slammed into a rock, jerking Alex around in a crazy circle, so that for the next 3 seconds he found himself travelling down the river backwards. He jammed the paddle in, using the current to turn, but his arms were almost torn off by the strain. But the float came round, then shot forward. All the water. He was coming to turn, almost then shot forward. All the water in the world fell on him. But then it was over. He was through. Ahead of him, the river was wider, and this time the vegetation was set further back, providing no cover. The kayak was being carried at speed. In fact, the river seemed to be moving faster and faster. Why? But I had no time to find an answer. He gasped and saw the sniper taking aim. He was so close that Alex could make out the stubble on his chin. The finger closed on the trigger. There was only one thing he could do. Do one last trick he could play. It might easily kill him, but Alex was fighting back, and he wasn't going to sit there and let the annoying man gun him down. The sniper fired. Alex let the bullet crease the side of his neck just above his shoulder. He wanted to scream. It was as if someone had drawn a kitchen knife across his flesh. At the exact moment, he took a deep breath, threw himself sideways, jerked up a knee, and turned the kayak upside down. He wanted the sniper to think, and the helicopter pilot to think they had got him. From the air, all they would be able to see was the upturned hull of the kayak. I was dangling beneath, his face and shoulders buffeted by the current. The paddling gripped tightly in his hands. He was still travelling at speed. If he hit a rock, he would be killed. It was as simple as that. It was either that or a bullet from above. The next minute was the longest of Alex's life. He could feel himself moving, but he could see nothing. When he tried to look, everything was a swirl of dark grey, and the water beat against his eyes. He could hear strange echoes of the river, and far away, the helicopter hovering above his head. His legs were locked above his head inside the kayak. His heart was pounding. His lungs were beginning to demand fresh air. He had to stay underwater. How long would the helicopter follow him before the sniper decided that his work was done? His chest was getting tighter, the bubbles escaping from his mouth and ears. Precious oxygen leaking out of him. He had no idea how long he had been submerged. He felt the kayak hit something, sending a shudder down his spine. This was madness. He was drowning. If he waited any much longer, he wouldn't have the strength to flip himself back up. At last, at the very end of the endurance, on the edge of the blackout, he acted. The move was called the hip slap. Alex curled his face into his body and pushed with the paddle. At the same time, he rolled his hips, forcing the kayak to turn. Everything happened at once. His head and shoulders cleared the surface, water streaming down his face. Tail burst all around him. The float swayed, then righted itself, gasping, dazed. Alex found himself in the middle of the river, moving faster than ever. And he was alone. The helicopter had gone. He could see it looping away towards a column of black smoke to rising from the hospital compound. So it had worked. They thought he was dead. Alex looked ahead of him and saw that he was understood why they had left him. It would have been a matter of time if he was still alive underneath the kayak, because what lay in front of him would kill him anyway. He had reached the Bora Falls. A straight line that was marked at the edge of the world. The river was rushing over it, hundreds and thousands of gallons. There was white cloud and mist hanging above the abyss, and beyond that, nothing. He could hear the water thundering down endlessly, and knew that there could be no going back. There was no power on earth that could stop him now. Alex wide opened his mouth and yelled as he swept hopelessly over the edge. Chapter 20. Batteries not included. For a long draw-out second, he hung in space with the roar of the Bora Falls in his ears, the spray in his eyes, and certainly that he couldn't possibly survive. The water was like some huge living thing rushing and exploding over the side of the rock face, and there would be no safe landing. Looking down, I saw a boiling cauldron 50 meters below, waiting to receive him. There was no time to think, no time to do anything, but react instinctively, half remembering lessons taught long ago. Somehow, he had to lessen the impact when he hit the surface below. Be aggressive. Don't let the waterfall just take you at the very last moment. Before he fell, Ash tensed himself, took a deep breath, and pulled hard with a single powerful stroke. The water tilted. The roar in his ears was deafening. He was blind. His head was being hammered. He was only aware of his hands gripping the paddle. The wrists locked, his muscles seizing up. Lean forward. You don't want to fight the water. You'll have to go with it. The higher the drop, the more anger you'll need when you hit the bottom. And he remembered when it was almost too late. Turn your head to one side, and the impact will smash every bone in your body, in your face. He was falling, half in the water, half in the air, faster and faster, trying to aim for the white. That's where the most air in the water, and the air will cushion your fall. Don't shout. You have to hold that breath. How much further could it be, and how deep was the basin? God, he would be smashed to pieces if he hit a rock. Too late to worry about that now. The spray was stinging in his eyes. He closed them. Why watch his own death? The guy had hit the cauldron nose first, and instantly sucked inside, dragging ice with it. He felt his legs and stomach take the full force of the impact below. The water overwhelmed him. It was pounding down on his shoulders, crushing him. His head was thrown back, and he felt the whiplash on his neck. The paddle was torn free, and then he was floundering, scrabbling, desperate, with his hands trying to free himself from the kayak, which was dragging him to the depths below. His elbow struck a rock, almost breaking the bone. The shock made him release his breath, and he knew he would only have seconds to reach the surface. But his legs were trapped. He couldn't pull them free. The kayak was sinking, taking him with it. Using all his strength, he twisted the slow boy, and somehow his hips cleared the edge of the float. He pulled first one leg, then the other. He was swallowing water. He no longer knew which way was up and which way was down. His feet was free. He lashed out once and then again. The water was spinning him, throwing him violently from side to side. He couldn't take any more. One last try, and his head and shoulders burst into the air. He was already far downstream. The ball force were behind him, impossibly high. There was no sign of the float. It must have been smashed to pieces. But as Alex sucked in fresh air, he knew they had done everything right, and that by a miracle he had survived. He had taken on the falls, and he had beaten them. The current slowed down. Alex's arms and legs were completely limp. All his strength had gone, and the best he could manage was to keep himself afloat, tilting his head to back so that his mouth stayed in the air. He felt as if he had swallowed a gallon of water, and vaguely wondered about cholera, yellow fever, and whatever else this tropical river might contain. ASIS had bothered giving him any injections before he flew to Bangkok. Well, he'd have to worry about that later, complain to them when the next time came. He had never felt so exhausted. The water had become a cushion. And he had almost wanted to lie back and go to sleep. How far had he travelled? Dr. Dan said that the falls were a mile from the compound, but he felt he had gone twice that distance. No sign of the helicopter. That was a good thing. They thought that he was dead, so they'd leave him alone. Sometime later, he found himself lying on a riverbank made up of shingle and sand. He had been washed up without even noticing, and had nodded off because the sun was now much higher in the sky. He allowed the warmth to creep into him. As far as he could tell, none of his limbs were broken. His neck and back were badly bruised and hurting. His spine had taken the full force of the impact, and there were cuts and scratches all over his torso, hips and legs. Torso, which is another word for shirt, hips and legs. But he knew that he had got off lightly. Chances of his surviving the waterfall had been tiny, but he had done so without a major injury, with a miracle. He remembered what Ash had told him about his father, the luck of the devil. Well, that was something Alex seemed to have inherited. Ash, Reef Island. The tsunami heading for Western Australia. Alex seemed to be so worried about himself that he had lost sight of the bigger picture. How long did he have before Major Yu set the bomb off? That would have such a devastating effect on the Earth. Tectonic plates. Was it already too late? Alex threw himself into a sitting position, trying to get life back into his battered frame. And as he warmed himself in the sun. At the same time, he worked it out. You had spoken of 4 days. At midnight on the fourth day, the Earth was going to be in the grip of some sort of gravitation pull, and the fault line deep down below seabed will be at its most vulnerable. 4 days. Alex spent 3 of them as a prisoner, so it was going to happen tonight. right now, it couldn't be much later than 10 o'clock in the morning. So, Alex had just over 12 hours to prevent a terrible catastrophe. The murder of 8 people on Reef Island and the deaths of thousands more in Australia. And that was when the complete hopelessness of the situation hit him. It was true he had managed to escape from the horrific death Major Yu had planned for him. Where was he? Looking around him, I saw that he had left the rainforest behind. He was on the edge of a floodplain with mountains in the far distance, perhaps 50 miles away. He was surrounded by stubby, dwarf-like trees that he couldn't name, a few boulders and some termite mounds. There was a sweet smell, something like mouldering wood in the air, and that was all. If nowhere had a middle, this was it. There was nothing he could do. Nobody was going to operate him, but he would die anyway, from either starvation or disease, assuming, of course, a saltwater crocodile didn't get him first. Alice wiped a grimy hand across his face. It seemed to him that from the moment of this mission had begun, nothing had gone right. He had never been in control. He cast his mind back to the office in Sydney and Ethan Brooke outlined what it to do. He would be there in provide cover. That was all. It would be easy. Instead of which he had been thrown into the worst 2 weeks of his life. God, he should have listened to Jack. He looked again at the mountains. It would take him a day to reach them at the very least. Too long. And why should he assume that anyone lived there? He hadn't seen any roads or houses from the plane. If only he could get in touch with MI6. He glanced at his wrist. Miraculously, despite the battering it had taken, the watch was still in one piece. The question was, why hadn't it worked? Spinners had built it for him personally. The watch had to be sending out a signal. So what possible reason could MI6 have to ignore it? Alice remembered his meeting with Miss Jones and Ben Daniels, Fox as he had once been known. Excuse me. Fox had once been known. He couldn't believe that the SAS man would let him down. So what had gone wrong? Jacob was watching and examined it. Although it looked cheap and tacky, something he might have bought in a street market in Afghanistan. Which would have been built to last. The strap must have been strong to survive. The journey over the Bora Falls, and Alex guessed the case was waterproof. The hands were still showing 11 o'clock. He turned the watch over. There was a groove running all the way around the inside. The back screwed off. He pressed his thumb against it and twisted. The case opened with a surprising ease. The watch contained some complicated micro security which Smidges must have designed and installed. It was completely dry. There was no evidence of any water seeping in. The whole thing was powered by a battery. It should have been in the middle of a circular compartment, right in the middle. But there were no batteries. The compartment was empty. There was his answer. That was the reason his signal hadn't been heard. There had been no signal. But how could it have happened? Spinels had already been on the side. It was completely unlike him to forget something so basic. And his fall back wary of fury. Thought life snatched away from him simply because of a missing battery. How was he going to find a replacement? Somehow he doubted he was going to discover a boots in the middle of the outback. For a moment, Alex was tempted to fling the watch into the river. He never wanted to see the bloody thing again. For a long time he didn't move. He let the sun beat down on him, drying out his clothes. A fly buzzed around his head and he swatted it away. He found himself playing back everything that had happened to him. The waterfall, the flight, through the rapids, the moment he had set the hospital ablaze. Had it really all been for nothing? And before that, his dinner with Major Yu, the chase on the Liberian Star, the discovery of Royal Blue, the sudden appearance of Copassus, the Tory warehouse in Jakarta. No battery. He remembered his time in Bangkok and what Ash had told him about his parents. That was the only reason he had agreed to all this, to learn something about himself. Had it been worth it? Probably not. Truth was, Ash was disappointed. Ash had disappointed him. His godfather, Alex, had hoped he would become a friend, but despite all of the time they had spent together, he hadn't really got to know him. He had never really got to know him. Ash was too much of a mystery, and from the very start, he had set out a trick to Alex with that business in the forest near Swanbourne. He remembered his first sight of Ash, dressed as a soldier and carrying an assault rifle, looming out of the darkness, as Alex stood on a fake mine in the middle of a fake barrage. But how could they have done that to him? He wanted any real danger. We knew where you were all the time. That was what Ash had told him that night at the Peninsula Hotel, sitting out by the swimming pool. Alex remembered it now. And how had they known? There was a beacon inside the heel of one of his trainers. Alex looked down at them. All the colour had faded, and they were ragged, full of holes. Was it possible? What he was thinking? He had been given the trainers when he was on the aircraft carrier. They had picked him up when he landed at Pacific. The beacon that had been added to Colonel Abbott when he was staying with the SAS in Swanbourne. He was wearing the same trainers now. He had been given a complete change of clothes, but by Cloudy Webber. But she had dressed him as an Afghan. But the shoes hadn't fitted him, so she had allowed him to keep his own. He hadn't changed until his dinner with Major U. He had worn an English Desire t-shirt and jeans, until he had arrived at the hospital, where there had been fresh clothes in his room. But neither Major U nor Dr. Tanner had provided him with new footwear. So a beacon that had been planted in Swanbourne had to be still on him. It wouldn't be working. It had been designed for short-range use, but it might be battery operated. Alex felt about a surge of excitement. He was so afraid of being disappointed. He leant down and pulled the trainer off so that he could examine them. Ash had told him the beacon was inside one of the heels. Alex turned the shoes over. The soles were made of rubber, and he couldn't see any openings or anything that looked like a secret compartment. He pulled out the insoles, and that's when he found it. It was in his left shoe, directly over the heel, a flap that had been cut into the fabric and then sealed. It took 10 minutes to prise it open, using his finger, his teeth, and a sharp stone from the riverbank. As it worked, he knew that this might all be for nothing. The battery had been there for 2 weeks. It might be dead. It surely wouldn't fit the transmit in the watch anyway, but the chances of finding a battery in the Australian outback had been 0 to begin with. He pulled open the flap, and there it was, a little pack of circuitry that had been designed to save his life during the bombardment in the forest. There was a little power source too, a straightforward lithium battery, about twice the size of the one that should have been in the watch. Alex eased it out and held it in the palm of his hand, as if it were a nugget of pure gold. All he had to do was connect it. He had no screwdriver, no conductor, no metal contact, nothing. Easy. In the end, he snapped 2 spikes of a nearby shrub and used them as miniature tweezers to pry out some of the wires from inside the heel. It seemed to take forever as the sun climbed higher. He felt the sweat trickling down his forehead, but he didn't stop to rest. Painstakingly, he unstitched the inside of the radio beacon, then broke off the 2 lengths of wire, each one barely more than a centimetre long. Did the battery still have any life? He rubbed the wires against it, and to his sight, it was rewarded by a tiny spark. So all he had to do was connect the battery to a watch using a couple of pebbles to keep everything in place. There was nothing more he could do. He set the battery next to the watch with the wires touching, feeding precious electricity into the transmitter, and balancing the entire thing on the rocks. After that, He went and lay down in the shade of the tree. Either the transmitter was working now or it wasn't. He would find out soon. A few minutes later, he was sound asleep. Chapter, I think 20? Yeah, chapter 20. No, chapter 21. Chapter 21, right? Oh, why do I have to keep checking on the contents? Because it's not the chapter. Not helpful, Anthony Horowitz. Not helpful at all. Chapter 21. Attack Force. Alex was woken by the sound of a helicopter. For a moment he was filled with dread, fearing the Bell UH-1D had returned. If that was the case, he would let them take him. He simply didn't have any more reserves of energy. He had nothing left which to fight back. But squatting in the sun, he saw at once this was the bigger helicopter with two sets of rotors, a Chinook, and there was a figure all leaning out of the door. Dark eyes, short black hair, and the hand raised in greeting. It was Ben Daniels! Alex clambered to his feet as the Chinook landed, and Alex clambered to his feet as the Chinook landed on a patch of scrubland a short distance away. He went over to it, taking care where he put his bare feet. He would be just his luck to step on a death adder now. Ben climbed out and stared at him. Then, before Alex could stop him, he grabbed hold of him and pulled him into a crushing embrace. "So here you are!" he exclaimed, shouting over the noise of the rotors. "I've been so worried about you." He let Alex go. "What the hell are you doing out here? Where have you been?" "It's a long story," Alex said. "Has it got anything to do with the smoke coming from upriver?" But Ben jerked a thumb. "We saw it as we flew. That used to be the hospital." Alex couldn't hide his relief that things were finally going his way. "Really glad to see you. Mr. Jones had been going frantic. We knew you'd flown to Jakarta, but we lost you after that. She's got people all over Indonesia, but she sent me to Darwin in case you made it across. I've been waiting there for 3 days, hoping you get in touch. You look terrible, like something cat dragged in." "That's how I feel." Alex stopped. "What time is it, Ben?" he asked. Ben was obviously surprised by the question. He looked at his watch. 1:10. "Why do you ask?" "We have to get moving. You've got less than 12 hours. Until what? I'll tell you on the way." Alex was feeling better than he had in a long time. He was warm and dry and fed, and the dangers of the last few days had slipped away behind him. He was lying on a comfortable bunk in the military compound just outside Darwin, which was where Ben Daniels had brought him earlier. He was wearing combats, the only clothes for Ben and had been able to find for him. For the last few hours, he had been left on his own. He could see a certain amount of activity taking place outside the window. Soldiers crossing the parade ground, jeeps speeding in and out of the main gate. The helicopter was still sitting where it had landed half an hour ago. A truck had pulled up, and Alex watched as refueling began. He wondered if it was significant. Maybe something was happening at last. Despite everything, he couldn't relax completely. It was 6:30, and very soon the sun would be setting. At the same time, the Earth and the Moon you had been waiting for. At midnight, the royal blue would be lowered beneath the seabed and detonated. The devastation would begin, and what would MI6 and ASIS do to prevent it? Alex had explained everything, not just to Ben, but to a whole post of Australian Army officers. His story was incredible, almost beyond belief. But the strange thing was that not one person in the room had doubted him. This was, after all, the boy who had dropped in from outer space. Alex supposed that was where he was concerned. Anything was now considered possible. One of the men was munitions. munitions expert, and quickly confirmed what Major Yu had said. It would be possible to manufacture an artificial tsunami. At midnight, the fault line would be in grip of an enormous gravitational pressure. Even a relatively small explosion would be enough to trigger a global catastrophe, and you had all the power of Royal Blue at his command. Of course, in one sense, Scorpion's mission had already failed. Thanks to Alex, the intelligence agencies knew that what they were planning, and even if everyone on the Reef Island were killed in a freak wave, nobody would now think it was an accident. Alex assumed that the island would be evacuated anyway. Just to be on the safe side, there was no longer any need for Major Yu to press the button. If he was sensible, he'd already be looking for somewhere to hide. But there was a knock on the door. Alex straightened up as Ben Daniels entered. He grinned. Grim. "They want you," he said. "Who?" "The cavalries have just arrived. They're in the mess." Alex walked across the compound with Daniel, wondering what had gone wrong, but was still being included. Member 6 had always treated him as a spy in one minute, a schoolboy, the next dumping him whenever it suited him. The mess was a low wooden building running the full length of the square, with Daniels right behind him. Alex opened the door and went in. Most of the officers had spoken earlier. The day was still there, boring out. Most officers had spoken earlier. The day was still there, poring over the maps and sea charts that had been spread out over the dining tables. They had been joined by two men that Alex had referred to. Ethan Brooke was sitting at a table, Mark Damon standing just behind him. Presumably they had flown up from Sydney. Garth, the guide dog, Alex accompanied and thumped his tail. At least someone was pleased to see him. "Alex!" The blind man had become aware of his presence. "How are you doing?" "I'm okay." Anson wasn't sure if he was happy to see the head of ASIS convert action. Ethan Brooke had manipulated him as cold-bloodedly as Alan Blunt would have done in London. It seemed to him that all these people were the same. "I know what you've been through. I can't believe the way things have played out, but you did a fantastic job." Major Yu knew about me all the time," Alex said. Even as he spoke the words, he knew they were true. The fight in Bangkok had been designed to cripple him. And on the library in Star, Alex had overheard Yu boasting to the captain. He had known Alex's identity before he entered the container. He had simply been playing with him for his own amusement. "Yes, we have a security leak and it's worse than we thought." Brooke glanced in the direction of his deputy, who looked away, as if he didn't want to make any command. "What happened to Ash?" I said. "We don't know. We only know what you told us." Brooke fell silent. Alex could see he was preparing himself for what he had to say. So what are you going to do, Alex asked. "We have a problem, Alex," Brooke explained. "Here's the situation. I'll give it to you straight. First thing is, the Reef Island conference is still going ahead." Alex was shocked. "Why?" "We told them they were in danger. Obviously, we couldn't give them all the details, but we suggested in the strongest possible terms that they pack their bags and get out of there. They refused. They said if they left, they'd look like cowards. Tomorrow they announce a press conference and how it's going to look if they've all sulked away overnight. We're still arguing with them, but in a way, I suppose they've got a point. Scorpio want them out of the picture. If they simply disappear, they'll be doing the job for them." I took this in. It was bad news. The reef encounter was part of the picture. After the tsunami hit the island, it will continue on its way to Western Australia. "Have we found Major Yu?" he asked. "Yes," Brooke smiled briefly. "He told you he would be on an oil platform in the time of sea, And we've gone through all the records, including the latest satellite images. There's an oil rig licensed to the China Trading Company of Bangkok. It's a semi-submersible platform more than 1,200 meters of the water, hundreds miles north of Reef Island, right over the fault line, Damon muttered. It was the first time he had spoken since Alex had come into the room. It's called Dragon 9. So that's it, Alex said. It seemed obvious to him. You bomb it. You blow it out of the water. Kill Major Yu and everyone who works for him. I wish it was as easy as that, Brooke replied. First of all, Dragon 9 is just outside Australian waters. It's an Indonesian territory. If we send a strike against it, it'll be like declaring a war. We can't even send one man in a boat without written authority. That could take days. Officially, we're stuck. Why can't you ask the Indonesian to help? The Indonesian to help. Why can't you ask the Indonesian to help? The Indonesian to help. Why won't you ask the Indonesian to help? They don't trust us. By the time we've persuaded them we're telling the truth, it'll be too late. So we're just going to sit back and let him get on with it. I couldn't believe what he was hearing. Obviously not. Why do you think we're here? Ben Daniels took a step forward. Why don't you tell Scorpio that you know what they're up to? He asked. You said it just now. The plan only works if we all think the tsunami was caused naturally. If we tell them they failed, maybe they'll back off. We've already thought of that, Damon replied. But Dragon 9 has shut down. It's observing radio silence, and even if we find a way to contact Meiji, he might go ahead anyway. Why not? He's obviously mad, and if the bomb's already in place, so what's in the answer, Brooke? Mr. Brooke, one of your other officers asked. A small British and Australian task force, unauthorized, illegal. Brooke turned to Alex. I've already spoken to you, Miss Jones, and she's agreed. We have very little time, but I've assembled some of our best people. They're kitting out right now. You and Daniel go with them. We parachute you onto the oil rig. You find Royal Blue and deactivate it. Meanwhile, my people kill Major Yu. If you locate the whereabouts of Ashton, so much the better. But he's not the priority. What do you say? Alex was too shocked to say anything. Next to him, Ben Daniel shook his head. I'm happy to go, he said, but you can't be serious. I'm asking Alex, and asking Alex, he's only a kid. If you haven't noticed, and I had said he's already done enough. Some of the Australian officers nodded in agreement, but Brooke wasn't having any of it. We can't do it without Alex, he said simply. Alex knew he was right. He already told them what he had done on board the Liberian Star. I scanned my fingerprints into Royal Blue. He said, I'm the only one who can deactivate it. He sighed. It had seemed like a good idea at the time. I expect you to look after him, Mr. Daniels. But Brooke continued, we don't have a lot of time to argue about this. It's already 7 o'clock and you've got a long flight ahead of you. So Alex, what do you say? 2 men and a woman were watching the sunset on Reef Island. The island was only a quarter of a mile, but it was striking beautifully within the white beaches. Deep green. The island was called a mile. It was like a mountain. All the colours of turquoise seemed to be real. In the north of the island, in the mangroves below, here sea eagles circled and monkeys chattered in the trees. But on the southern side, everything was calm and flat. There was a wooden table and a bench on the sand, but no deck chairs, no sun umbrellas, no Coke bottles, or anything that might suggest that. Just over the horizon, the 21st century was ticking on. There was only one building on Reef Island, a long wooden house with a thatched roof, partly on stilts. There were no generators. The only electricity supplied by the wind or water power. A large organic garden provided all the food. The owner of the house ate fish but not meat. A few cows grazing in the field were milked twice a day. There were chickens to lay eggs. An elderly goat wandering free. But it was no use at all. But it had been there so long that nobody had the heart to ask it to leave. In the last few days, the island had been invaded by a press corps, which had established itself in a series of tents-like structures behind the house. The journalists had brought their own generators and meat and alcohol, and everything else they would need for a press conference the next day. They were enjoying themselves. It was nice to be able to report a story that people actually wanted to hear, and the weather during the last few days had been perfect. The woman on the beach was actress Eve Taylor, who owned the island. She had made quite a lot of bad films, or one or two good ones, and she didn't really care which were which. They all paid the same. One of the men was an American multi-millionaire, a billionaire in fact. Although in recent years he had been given much of his wealth away, the other man was a pop singer, Rob Goldman, who had just arrived following his tour of Australia. ASIS are insisting we should leave, Goldman was saying. They say we could all be killed. Have they explained the nature of the threat? The billionaire asked. No, but they sounded serious. Of course they did. The actress let sand run through her fingers. They want us to go. This is a trick. They're trying to scare us. I don't think so, Eve, Goldman said. He took a glance at the horizon. We're safe, he said. Look how beautiful it is. Look at the sea. That's part of the reason we're here, to protect us for the next generation. I don't care if there's a danger. I'm not going to run away. She turned to the billionaire. Crispin? Naturally said, I'm with you, he said. I never ran away from anything in my life, and I'm not starting now. 300 miles further from south, in the towns of Derby, Broome and Port Hedland, thousands of people were watching the same sunset. Some of them were on their way home from work. Some were tucking children into bed, in pubs, in cars, or on the beaches, wherever. They were simply edging towards the end of another day. And none of them knew that in a few hours' time, the bomb known as Royal Blue would begin to inch its way down the pipe, which would carry it to the seabed, and below the Earth and the Moon. The Earth and the Moon were edging towards the end of the Earth and the Moon. And none knew in a few hours the bomb the Royal Blue found that the Earth and the Moon were moving inexorably in an alignment with the sun, which wouldn't happen again for another century. And that a madman was waiting to press the button which would unleash chaos on the world. 5 hours until midnight, and in any army camp south of Darwin, Alex Ryder gave his answer, and final preparations begin. Chapter 22, Dragon 9. Ethan Brooke had picked 10 soldiers from the Australian SAS for his assault team, and at least some of them needed to go introduction. As Alex joined them in a hangar, he was going to be used as a briefing room. He saw Scooter and Texas, X-Ray and Sparks waiting for him. And suddenly, he was back where this had all begun, in this forest near Swanbourne. He wasn't sure if he should be glad or annoyed to meet up with them again. Scooter was equally uncomfortable. I'm really sorry. Sorry about that trick we pulled on you, Alex, he said. We felt bad about it, but we had our orders. Colonel Abbott asked us to pass on a message, Tex decided. No hard feelings, if you ever come back to Swanbourne, we'll throw you a proper Aussie barbecue with no hand grenades. Alex muttered, You got it. Alex looked at the other soldiers. None of them seemed to be older than 24. or 25, meaning that there was an age gap of 10. All of them had accepted. There's an age gap of 10. All of them accepted him, like Alex. Like Alex, they had changed into night combat gear. A couple of them carried balaclavas. The rest had painted their hands and faces black. The hangar was vast and empty. A flipboard had been placed in front of 2 rows of metal benches. Alex sat down next to Ben. The others took their place, Scooter facing them. Once again, he seemed to be in charge. Scooter was looking tired. He seemed to have grown a lot older since Alex had last seen him. Or maybe it was just that he knew how much was at stake. "We haven't got much time," he began, "but nor do we have much of a plan, so this won't take long. We're parachuting in from about 8,000 feet. I know a boat would have been easier and less conspicuous, but by the time we got there, it would all be over. Anyway, it's always possible our friend Major U has radar." Down to the flipboard, someone had taped up what could have been an engineer's drawing. It would have been an engineer's drawing of 2 oil platforms, one square, the other triangular, joined together by a narrow bridge. Each one of the platforms had 3 cranes, and one had a helicopter pad represented by a H in a circle. Scooter picked up a stick which he used as a pointer. "All right, listen up," he tapped the plan. This is what we think Dragon Island looks like. We don't know because we don't have any pictures, and we haven't had time to take any. And I can tell you for certain that it's a semi-submersible platform, which means it's basically the whole thing floats on the surface of the water, connected to the seabed by a dozen steel tethers. In case you're wondering, each one is about 2 kilometers long. "What happens if they break?" someone asked. Nothing much. The whole thing will float away like a ship without an anchor. At least that's something we don't have to worry about. He pointed again. "This is the processing platform on the left. Dragon 9 isn't in production, so the whole area will be quiet. And that's when we're going to start. We'll land on the helipad. This H here. Now Scooter turned his attention to the square of the shaped rig. "This is the drilling platform," he continued. "Once we've assembled and checked that everyone's there, we'll make our way across the bridge, heading for the main derrick, the metal tower, and over the well hole. And that's where we're going to find Royal Blue. Our friend Major U will be using some sort of system. Maybe guide wires to lower it down to the seabed. So let's blow it up," X-Ray growled. "It's our first target," Scooter agreed. "The power unit will be our second. But we can't take any for granted. Despite what you told Alex, he could just as easily be using a submarine to take the bomb down. That's why Alex is here. Our job is to find control room and get him there, and he can deactivate Royal Blue, but no one else can. So if he gets the shot, we might as well pack up and go home. You hear what I'm saying? I want you to watch his back, and his front and the sides." Alex glanced down. He understood what Scooter was saying, and why he had to say it. But he still didn't like to be being singled out in this way. "I'm afraid this mission isn't as easy as it seemed," Scooter added. "Although Alex would have said it looked simple to begin with. We've no ideas where the control room is. There are 5 different levels, 2 separate platforms. But you could be on either. You've got to think of Dragon 9 as 2 metal cities. They've got their own storage depots, dormitories, messes and recreation rooms, as well as fuel tanks, desalination units, pump rooms, engineering blocks, and all the rest of it. Somehow we have to navigate our way through all that until we have to navigate our way through all that until we find what we're looking for. Then we have to deal with royal blue, and when we start, it's possible that we're going to spread out of all over the place. We're lucky that there's not too much breeze and no moon. Just try not to fall into the sea. He paused. 11 silent faces watched him from the 2 rows of benches. Alice could feel the clock already ticking away. Alice wanted to be out and away. So what do we have on our side? Scooter asked. Well, as first there's an element of surprise. Meiji thinks Alex is dead, so he'll have no idea we're on our way. There's a question of timing. He looked at his watch. You can't detonate the bomb whenever he likes. You got to wait until midnight. That's where the sun and moon are going to be in the right position. It's 9 o'clock now, and we're only 2 hours from drop-off. That means we'll only have 1 hour to find you before he... There's a question of timing. He looked at his watch. You can't detonate the bomb whenever he likes. You got to wait until midnight. That's where the sun and moon are going to be in the right position. It's 9 o'clock now, and we're only 2 hours from drop-off. That means we'll only have 1 hour to find you before he can throw the switch. And there's something else that we know thanks to Alex. The bomb can only remain at a depth of 1 kilometre below the seabed for 20 minutes. It's not there yet. And if all goes well, it never will be. He looked around. Any questions? There were none. We've got to move quickly, he concluded. Take out as many of these people as we can before they know we're there. Leave the guns and grenades for as long as possible. Use your knives and find the control room. That's what this is all about. He put down the pointer. Let's go. Everyone stood up. Ben had Alex's parachute, black silk for night drops. He'd packed it himself before the briefing, and now he helped Alex put it on, putting the straps tight across his chest and around his thighs. Sorry, probably a bit too late to ask you this before, he muttered. But have you ever parachuted before? Only once, Alex admitted. That had been nearly 8 months ago. He had landed on the roof of the Science Museum in London, but he decided not to go into all that right now. Well, don't worry if you missed the target, Ben said. The sea's warm, conditions are perfect, and with a bit of luck there won't be too many sharks. The Australian SAS men were already moving. Ben strapped on his own parachute, and the 2 of them followed the others out of the hangar. There was a helicopter waiting for them on the tarmac, the same one that had picked Alex up in the jungle. Chinook CH-247 was the ideal machine for this night's work. Often was used to ferry troops of supplies. Its wide rear exit was also perfect for parachute drops. It would fly them to a target at 190 miles an hour, and at altitude no higher than 8,500 feet. They wouldn't leave long to deploy the chute. Ben must have been reading his thoughts. We're using a static line, he said. The static line deployment system means that they wouldn't have to pull a ripcord. The parachutes would open automatically. Alex nodded. His mouth was suddenly too dry to speak. They climbed in the back. In the jungle, Alex had used a door just behind the cockpit. This time the whole rear section of the Chinook had been opened, forming a ramp big enough to take a jeep. Alex looked in. The pilot and the co-pilot were already in their seats. There was a third man, a flight engineer, checking a 7.62mm M60 general purpose machine gun, which would have been bolted on at some point during the day. Alex hoped it wouldn't be needed. 12 of them took their places, so 2 long rows of seats faced each other on either side of fuselage. Although they were made of canvas stretched over the metal, they reminded Alex a little of dining room chairs. Normally the Chinook carries 30 men, so at least there were plenty of room. Alex sat next to Ben. It was clear that everyone expected them to stick together, although how they would manage that parachuting out into the night was something that they hadn't discussed. Scoot lead opened and clipped Alex's whipcord to a silver rail running all the way to the cockpit. The pilot pressed the switch and slowly the rear door closed. A red light flashed on. The helicopter lurched off the ground, and moments later they were on their way. It was dark and there was nothing to see out of the windows, which were too small anyway to provide much of view. I could only tell that their fight from the feeling in the stomach and the pressure in his ears. The SAS men were sitting silently, some of them checking their weapons. Machine guns, pistols with silencers attached, and a wide variety of vicious-looking combat knives. Next to him, Ben Danielson nodded off to sleep. Alex guessed he'd be well practiced at taking a cat nap whenever he needed it, conserving his strength, but Alex couldn't sleep. He was in a Chinook helicopter with the Australian SAS on his way to attack an oil rig and defuse a bomb before it causes tsunami. And as usual, he was the only one who hadn't begun a gun. How had he managed to get himself into this? For a moment, he remembered walking with Jack around the rocks in Sydney. It seemed a long, long time ago. How could he have allowed it all to happen? The helicopter droned on through the night. Below them, the Timor Sea was black and still. They were rapidly approaching Indonesian airspace. The light turned orange, smoothly a centimetre at a time. The great door revealed the back of the helicopter. Now drooped open, revealing the black wash of the night outside. Although it was true there was no moon. The sea seemed to be shining as if it was with some natural fluorescence. I couldn't see it glinting far below. He hadn't even thought about the parachute jump until now. But as reality hit him, he jumped until now. But as the reality hit him, his stomach lurched. The simple truth was that he was some sort of daredevil who enjoyed the prospect of hurling himself 8,000 feet from a helicopter in the dark. And now, he would have given anything to be back in London with Jack. Well, all he had to do was survive the next hour or way or another. In just 60 minutes, this would all be over. The door had gone down as far as it could and clicked into position. It was jutting out of the back of the helicopter, a short walk into nothing. "I'll be watching you!" Ben shouted with the roar of the wind. Only Alex heard, "Don't worry, I'll stick close." "Thanks!" And I shouted back the single word. Then the light went green. No time to think because of his position. Because Alex was going to be the first out. Maybe they had planned it that way. He didn't hesitate. If he stopped to think at what he was doing, he might lose his resolve. 3 steps straining cord from his parachute behind him. Suddenly, blades were right over his head, thrashing the air. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Ben. He jumped. There was a moment of complete disorientation. He remembered it from the last time when he couldn't quite believe what he'd done, and no idea what would happen next. He was falling so fast that he couldn't control his breath. He was completely out of control. Then the parachute opened. He felt the jolt as it descended slowly, and then the piece he was floating, dangling underneath an invisible silk canopy, black against the black night sky. He looked down and saw the oil rig. He could only make out its vogue shape. 2 geometric islands with a narrow corridor in between. There were about 20 lights flickering and still tiny on the twin platforms. By joining them together to his imagination, Alex was able to draw a mental imagine of Dragon 9. He twisted around and saw a helicopter already far away, and beneath it the 11 black flowers that were the other parachutes. It seemed to him that the Chinook was surprisingly quiet. If he could barely hit at this altitude, perhaps Major Yu would have heard nothing below. Just as Scooter had promised. There was no wind. The sea had promised there was no wind. Just as Scooter had promised there was no wind. The sea was utterly flat. Alex didn't need to steer himself. He seemed to be heading in exactly the right direction. He could make out the white H in the middle of the helipad. H for happy landing. At least that's what he hoped. There are 3 stages to a parachute descent. The raw fear of the jump itself, the sense of calm once the chute has opened, and the panic as the ground rushes up. Alex reached the 3rd stage all too soon, and that was when he realized he had drifted off course after all. Maybe he had been overconfident. Maybe some sea breeze had caught his unawares. Suddenly he found himself nothing but water below. He drifted away from the triangular processing platform. Suddenly Alex tugged the 2 cords at his shoulders, trying to change direction, plunging towards the sea, but he couldn't let that happen. The splash might give the others away. Worse than that, he might drown. Alex jerked and writhed helplessly, but at the last minute, another breeze caught him and carried him over the lip of the drilling platform and onto one of the decks. He had been doubled. Luckily, the deck wind was enough to allow him to land safely, dropping to one knee and folding his parachutes in a single movement, and the area was like a metal courtyard enclosed on all sides. With a bit of luck, he could be completely out of sight. No worries there. He landed on a bumpy, uneven surface close to some sort of electrical generator. The noise of machinery would have covered the crash of his feet, and as they had made contact with the metal surface. 5 seconds later, a figure dropped out of the sky, and just a few minutes later, it was Ben Daniels. Unlike Alex, he had chosen the deck with pinpoint accuracy. He had gathered in the chute and gave Alex the thumbs up. Alex twisted around as far as he could see. All the SAS man had landed on the processing platform. He looked up. The helicopter had already gone, but presumably it would be nearby, in case it was needed. Alex realized that his own experience had spoiled Scooter's plan. The whole idea had been to stick together. It was vital Alex should be protected at all times. Now he and Ben were cut off from the drilling platforms. The SAS man would have to make their way across the bridge to find him, and if used control room was on the other side, they would have to take Alex all the way back again. Not good. He looked around him. He was standing on a row of pipes. He was standing on a row of pipes that would be dragged up and somehow assembled in a straight line before they were lowered all the way to the seabed. And beyond it, on the other side, a metal wall rose up like the side of a fortress. There were windows on the 3rd or 4th floor, but they were so covered in dirt and grease that surely nobody would be able to see through them. One of the cranes stretched out over the water, its arms silhouette against the stars and the night sky. Ben Daniels had taken off the parachute. He scuttled over to Alex, keeping low. He must have already come to the same conclusion as Alex. He decided what to do. "We won't wait," he whispered. "We'll start looking over here. We don't have a lot of time." Alex didn't have a watch. lived with Ben's. It was 11:10. He wondered how so much time could pass so quickly. That's better. Sorry. The two of them set off together, making their way across the pipes, trying to find the entrance into the wellhead. The dragon was bigger as they expected. Every inch was crammed with pipes and cables, cogwheels, chains, dials and valves. The oil rig was a living thing, throbbing and humming as a different machine carried power or coolant to the various outlets. It was a hard, unpleasant environment. Every surface had a permanent coating of mud. Every surface had a permanent coating of mud. Every surface had a permanent coating of mud. Every entrance had a perfect coating of cogwheel change dials and valves. The oil ring was living thing, throbbing and humming as if machines carried power or coolant to the various outlets. It was a hard, unpleasant environment. Every surface had a permanent coating of mud, oil, grease, and puddles of salt water. Alex could feel his trainer sticking to the floor as he walked. But you didn't seem to have posted any guards. But you hadn't seemed to post any guards. You hadn't seemed to posted one single guard there. Shocking. We would usually have done that. If I know you would have done that. Scooter had been right about that. With Alex supposedly dead. With Alex supposedly dead. Blink out the miniature torch, covered in his left hand, and a trickle of light to escape. More than 1,000 meters below, everyone was carrying a miniature torch, kept covered in his left hand, only allowing a trickle of light to escape. His right hand held an automatic pistol. A Walter PPK with a Morse silencer attached. Scooter and the other CS man had dropped out of sight, and they could imagine them moving towards him on the other side of the water in the far distance. He thought he heard a soft thud, the clatter of metal against metal. He stifled cry cut off so very quickly. There were guards after. If so, we go guards after. If so, maybe there were guards after all. If so, one of them might be wishing that he had been a little bit more alert. Peter was opening doors, peering in through the windows. There was still no sign of drilling platforms. They climbed a flight of steps that brought them to a metal walkway on the very edge high over the sea. He stood down, and that was when he saw the oil rig was actually bouncing on 4 huge legs, like an oversized metal table. One of the legs had a ladder which ran all the way down to the surface of the water and disappeared beneath it. Next to the ladder and tucked away almost underneath the drilling platform was an executive yacht. Sort of thing that would have looked more at home in a private marina in the south of France. The boat was about 45 feet in length and sleek and white, with several sun decks, and a bow that was designed clearly. And a boat that was designed The boat was about 45 feet in length, sleek and white, with several sun decks, and Alex tapped on Ben on the shoulder and pointed. Ben nodded. It had to belong to Major U. It surely would provide him with a fast escape, which meant that he had to be close by. If Alex had known the make of the hatch, there would have been no doubt of his mind at all. It was a Sea Line F42 to 5 flybridge motorboat with the unique extend cockpit system. It had been designed and manufactured in Britain. Ben signalled the way forward more than ever. Alex wished that Scooter and the others were with them. They were following a narrow gantry that led to the doors. Led to the narrow gantry that led to the doors, and they somehow managed. There were 2 men in the control room, surrounded by computer screen radio emitters and the equipment that I had seen on the library. So one of them was Major Winston Yu. He was holding the pistol which he had just used to gun down Ben Daniels. What? The control. Alex wished that Scooter and the others were with them. They followed a narrow gantry that led to a door set in a circular building jutting out of the corner of the rig with curved windows that provided views in 3 directions. The control room had to be. They crept towards it. I didn't know what Ben had in mind. They was going to wait the rest of this quarter to catch up. That was the sensible thing to do. But in the end, he was never going to be given a choice. Without warning, a spotlight swept through the air. Seconds it crossed the drilling platform. Seconds later, a machine gun began firing. Bullets ricocheting crazily off the railing, slamming into the walls and sparkling as they flew off the metal walkways. The siren began to wail, and at the same time Alex heard answering fire from the other side of the bridge. There was silence as the night had been shattered. There was an explosion, a ball of flame erupting into the night like a brilliant flower. More shooting. Ben twisted and fired twice. Alex didn't even see his target. There was a cry and a man fell out of the sky, slammed into a gantry and bounced off it into the sea. "This way!" Ben shouted. "This way, Ben! This way!" Ben shouted. He had already started forward, and Alex went with him. Went after him. Already dead, you would be expecting them now, but there could be no going back. These men would be taking up position all over the oil rig. They had the advantage. There were dozen ladders they could climb, and decks high above from where they could pick off the invaders one by one. He and Ben would be safe inside. The door ahead of them, leading into the circular room, Ben reaching and crashed down. "Stay back," he commanded. I saw him count to 3, then slammed the door open and went in firing. Despite what he had been told, and even though he wasn't carrying a weapon himself, Alex followed. That was how he saw what happened in the next few seconds. Even though it could be a lot longer before he could take it in, there were 2 men in the control room, surrounded by computer screens, radio transmitters, and the equipment that Alex had seen on the library and Star. One of them was Major Winston Yu. He was holding a pistol which had just used to gun down Ben Daniels. Ben was lying on the floor in a spreading pool of his own blood. The warmth of PPK had dropped out of his hand and lay pointed towards Alex. There was another man lying face down a short distance away, and Alex realized that Ben must have shot him as he came in. Major Yu was unhurt. He was staring at Alex in astonishment and disbelief. Somehow he managed to recover. "Well, this is a surprise," he said. Alex didn't move. He was less than 3 meters away from you. He had nowhere to go. You could shoot him at any time. "Come in and close the door," you ordered. Alex did as he was told. Outside, the battle was still going on. It was happening on the other platform, too far away. The area door clicked shut. "I knew you hadn't drowned in the river," you said. "Something told me, and when we couldn't find your body..." He shook his head. "I have to say, Alex, you're very hard to kill." Alex didn't reply. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Ben's pistol lying on the floor. Part of him wondered if he could dive around and grab it, but he would never be able to bring it round fire in time. He was too easy a target. "You're finished, Major Yu," Alex said, "and you failed. ASIS know what you're trying to do. Reef Island has been evacuated. There's no point setting off a tsunami. Everyone know it was you." He considered his words carefully. Part of what Alex had said was a lie, that the Reef Island conference was still taking place. There was no way you could know that. Alex was here. He had brought in the SAS with him. The facts spoken for themselves. Eventually, you sighed. You're probably right, he said. But I think we'll go ahead anyway. After all, it's taken meticulous planning. I'd like to make my mark on the world, but you'll kill thousands for no reason. What reason can I give them to spare them? What reason can you give me to spare them? You shook his head. World chaos does have its uses, Alex. This was never just about Reef Island. The reconstruction of Australian coastline will cost billions. And I have a commercial interest all over Southeast Asia. The China Trading Company has shared in many building firms who would be first in line for the new contracts. Unwin Toys will offer gifts to the many hundreds of new orphans, paid for, of course. He glanced at one of the television screens and I saw a white line running straight from the top of the bottom. There was a blind red square attached to it, moving slowly downwards. Royal Blue, you said, is in 6 or 7 minutes. It will reach the seabed and enter the shaft that I told you about. The shaft continues a further 1 kilometer down. At midnight exactly, the bomb will detonate, and my work will be done. But then I will be a long way away, and you will be no more than a fading memory. You raised his gun. The single black eye searched for him. Goodbye, Alex. But there was a movement, and the man who had been shot by Ben Daniels groaned and dragged himself into a sitting position. Major was delighted. How very fortunate, he exclaimed, lowering the weapon. Before you die, let me introduce you to one of my most trusted and effective colleagues. Although on second thoughts, I believe you already met. The man looked up. It was Ash. He'd been shot twice in the chest, and the life was seeping out of him. Alice could see it in the dark eyes were filled with pain and remorse, and something which was less definable, which might have been shame. Oh, I'm sorry, Alex. Ash gasped. He had to pause his catch breath. I didn't want you to know. I'm not sure Alex is surprised, you mocked. Alex shook his head. I guessed. May I ask how? This time there was no point in ignoring the question. He was about to shoot him anyway. The longer Alex could keep talking, the more chance that the SAS might finally arrive. Alex could still hear the alarm, but there was less shooting, and it seemed to be further away. Had the SAS been overpowered, or were they in command and on their way? He glanced at the television screen. Little Red Square was continuing its journey that way down. Everything went wrong from the start, he said, talking directly to Major Yu. Ethan Brooke had already lost 2 agents. Somehow the Snakehead knew everything he planned. They knew about me too. Why else were I chosen for that fight in Bangkok? At first it didn't make any sense, but then I realized when I was in the arena, and Namsuk said something to me. He said he'd kill me if I didn't take part. And he said it in first French and then English. Why? If he'd really believed I was an Afghan boy, he'd have known that I wouldn't speak either. I wondered about that, but it got worse. Ash gave me an emergency telephone number. I called it, and it led me straight to you. Ash opened his mouth to speak, but Ash cut in. I know, he said. You look briefly at the dying man. You made it look good with the fake blood. And if you'd been taken prisoner like me, then I lost the 2 gadgets Smith had given me, and that's when I knew it had to be you. I told you about the watch and the belt. Somehow the battery went missing out of the watch. I suppose you must have removed it when I was asleep that night in Jakarta. As for the belt, maybe you took that when I was in the house. But I had never told you about the coins. Smith had also given me 3 coins with explosive charges, and they stood in my pocket. If I told you, I guess they would have gone too. He stopped. When did you start working for Scorpio, Ash? Ash glanced at Major Yu. Tell him, you snapped. But be quick, he snapped. I don't think we have very much time. It was after Medina, and his voice was weak, his face was grey, and he could no longer move from the waist down. One hand was on his chest, the other lay palm upwards on his forehead. I can't understand, Alex. I was so badly hurt. Your son coughed, blood spurted from his hip. I had given everything to the service, my life, my health. I wasn't even 30, and I was crippled. I was never going to sleep properly, never eat properly from the day on. And it was just pills and pain. And what was my reward? Blunt humiliated me. I was promoted, taken out of the field. He told me. I swallowed painfully, with every word he was finding it hard to go on. He told me what I already knew here. I was second rate, never as good as your dad. He almost come to the end of his strength. His shoulders stopped for a moment. Alex thought the blood was all around him. Now a second flow trickled from his mouth. Maybe he was enjoying himself. Why don't you tell him the rest, Ash? He growled. No. Ash straightened his head. Please. I already know, Alex said. He turned to Ash one last time. You don't bear to him. You killed my parents, didn't you? The bomb on the airplane, you put it there. Ash couldn't answer. His hand tightened on his chest. He had only seconds left. We had to test him, Meiji explained. When he came over to us, we had to make sure he was telling us the truth. After all, we had just been tricked by one British intelligence agent, your father. So we sent him a very simple task, and also provided us with no doubt that he was ready to switch sides. I didn't want to. It was Ash's voice. It was just a whisper. He didn't want to, but he did. For the money. He put the bomb on the plane and he detonated it with his own hand. One more successful than his mission in Medina, and the start of a long association with us. Ash tried to look up. His head fell forward. He died. Meiji prodded him with his foot. Well, as they say, ash to ashes and dust to dust. He remarked, I'm glad you hear that from him, Alex. You can take it with you to the grave. He raised the gun once again and pointed it at Alex. There was an explosion loud and near. The entire room shook, and dust and metal things came showering down from the roof. Alex heard a shearing of metal as the crane overhead broke in half and came crashing down. The shock sent Meiji reeling back. His arm banged against one of the work surfaces and the gun went off. One of the bullets smashing harmlessly into a wall. Meiji was shouting in agony, and Alex realized that the impact of the blow had shattered the brittle bone in his arm. The gun now lay on the ground. Deafened, half-dazed, Alex threw himself onto Ben's gun, snatched it in both hands and pulled the trigger over again till it clicked uselessly. It was the first time he had ever fired in anger and with deliberate intention to kill, but he had a mission. The room was solid smoke, and even in pain, you had made thinking enough to use it as a screen. Crouching down, clutching the broken arm, he had lost his gun. He knew that he had run out of time. The SAS were here. Alex Ryder would have to wait until another day. There was a trapdoor set into the floor with the ladder I spotted earlier leading down underneath. Somehow he using his one good arm, you pulled it open and clambered down, dropping into the boat below. But the fall was too much for his bones. Hungry, agony, barely able to crawl, you groped his way over to the controls. He used a knife to cut through the mooring rope. A second later, he was speeding away. Meanwhile, Alex had staggered over to the controls. On the TV, the little square representing royal blue was about 2 centimeters above seabed, but edging closer all the time. Meanwhile, Alex had staggered over to the controls on TV. The little square representing royal blue was about 2 centimeters above the seabed, but edging closer all the time. There was a scanner wired into the computer. Alex slammed his palm onto the glass panel and let out a sigh of relief as a line of text appeared on the computer screen. Authorization accepted. There was a pause. Then a second line scrolled across. Override master commands. Y/N. Alex hit the Y key just as the door crashed open and half a dozen SAS men burst in, covering every angle with their weapons. Scooter was at the front, Texas and X-Ray right behind him, and it looked as if Sparks, the young soldier who had once played a guitar on the Australian beach, had made it. Scooter saw Alex. "Where's you?" he demanded. "Gone." Alex's attention was fixed on the screen. A menu had come up. He ran his eye down the list of options, looking for the one that said disarm or deactivate, but it wasn't there. Instead, his eye settled on the last command, detonate. "Over here!" It was Texas. He had found Ben Daniels and already needed beside him, tearing open his shirt to examine his wound. One of the other soldiers rushing over a medical kit. Alex slid the mouse, highlighting the last command. He looked at the television screen. Royal Blue was still above the seabed, but was gradually closing in. He remembered what he had heard. The bomb had to travel 1 kilometer down into the Earth's crust before it was in place. A digital clock read 23 hours, 47 minutes and 5 seconds and 0 milliseconds. The microseconds flickering and changing too fast for his eye to follow. The bomb position, the sun, moon and Earth were not quite ready yet. Could Alex destroy the bomb without accidentally causing a tsunami? In desperation, he turned to the SAS leader, who seemed to understand the stakes almost at once. "Do it," he said. Alex double-clicked on the command. 1,050 meters below, Dragon 9, 150 meters below, and the seabed, the bomb exploded. I felt the entire oil rig shuddered violently, and the floor veered crazily beneath his feet as 5 of the stealth tethers along the drill pipe itself were tore apart. And half a mile away, speeding through the water in a sea-lined yacht, Major heard the explosion and knew that with an overwhelming sense of bitterness and defeat that even his last hopes had been destroyed. Somehow, Royal Blue had been detonated too early. There would be no tsunami. He sat hunched in front of the steering wheel, moaning quietly to himself. He had failed. He didn't even feel the shockwave from the explosion until it hit him. For this, of course, was the main purpose of Royal Blue. To flatten anything for miles around. The pulse smashed into the boat, destroying the electrics, snuffing out the lights, ripping every fishing park. Major's bone structure wasn't strong enough to withstand it. Every single little bone in his body fractured at the same time for about 2 seconds. He remained vaguely human. Then his bone body, with no frame to support it, crumpled in on itself, a bag of skin full of broken pieces. The boat veered round. A quarter of a million pounds worth of British engineering was no one to steer it. Zigzagging crazily, it disappeared into the night. Back on Dragon 9, whose remaining men were being rounded up. The SAS lost 2 men dead, with 3 more injured. Ben Daniels was still alive. He'd been given a shock morphine, and there was an oxygen mask strapped to his face. Scooter had finally noticed the other body lying in the control room. "Who's that?" he asked. Alex took one look at his body. "It's nobody," he said. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for listening to this 1 hour, 40 minutes, 3 minutes book.